My name is Fahim Khondaker. I'm a Muslim. I was born in Bangladesh. I grew up in South Africa, and then I moved to Australia about 20 years ago at the age of 16. In terms of Bangladesh, my whole family is there. Everyone's there. We're just I think my dad was probably the first one to leave the family, leave Bangladesh. My maternal granddad passed away when I was 2 years old. My paternal grandmother passed away long before, so I only had a grandfather and a grandmother on either side. They didn't live nearby, but got to see them a little bit. The Bangladesh I remember when I was small, we lived in the hospital quarters, so all the doctors had apartments inside the hospital precinct. There was a slum just maybe 200 meters on the other side of the wall that closed off the border. It was a gated community. So I could have easily been born in a slum. That's how far life can be like that, right? And yeah, so the Bangladesh I remember was our quarter had 4 apartments, and we were on the top right one, and there were 4 kids, the ones downstairs from us, and I guess we grew up with them. They were much older than me, so I'd just follow them, want to be like the older kids, and just run around with them. So Dad's a doctor. His story is probably it's probably one of the most inspirational and fascinating stories I've ever seen, and just shows you the power of education. So he grew up in a village in Bangladesh, was obviously very, very smart. Both my mum and him got some bursaries or scholarships in grade 5 and grade 8. And I was told that only about 40 kids out of 400,000 get them or something, and both of them got them in different parts of Bangladesh. They were one of the 40 in their respective years. So obviously very talented and gifted, intelligence-wise, and Dad worked really, really hard. And anyway, studied medicine, graduated from medicine in 1981. And Bangladesh being a relatively overpopulated country, back then it's changing now slowly in the sense that a lot of people do want to stay in Bangladesh, but it was quite aspirational to go overseas and migrate for a little while. I mean, it's no different to Australians wanting to go to the UK for a couple of years, I guess. But so Dad, in 1981, applied all over the world for some jobs. Heard nothing for 12 years. And then in August 1993, we got a telegram saying, hey, do you still want a job? And it was in South Africa, in Transkei. And I still remember the day. I don't know why I was there at the door, and he was all excited, screaming and laughing, in just pure joy, elation that he's made it through after something this long. And then 12 years of silence. And then the next week, another offer comes in from Trinidad and Tobago. So I could have had a very cool accent right now. Could have been saying things like Yaman, okay, but I didn't get to do that. So we picked Transkei in South Africa. We moved to South Africa. And yeah, and then the initial plan was a 3-year contract in 1993, and we were going to go back in 3 years. By that stage, he was a doctor for 12, 13 years. He was pretty well settled in his career. His pathway was pretty set, so it wasn't a plan to move permanently. It's now been 30 years, and we haven't gone back. In terms of moving back, at least we've been back a few times. But yeah, that's the story. At the age of 6, we moved to South Africa, and it was actually apartheid at the time. So it was 1993, so it wasn't really technically South Africa. It was a place called Transkei, which is like a little homeland inside South Africa for people of colour, black people and non-white people essentially, and you needed a permit or a passport to go over into South Africa, even though it might have been the next suburb over. So my first school over there was like one of those schools you see in like a World Vision ad. Those four classrooms, no running water, no flushing toilets. Yeah, it was one of those types of really village remote town. My dad was a doctor at the local hospital, where I think he tells me 90% of his patients had TB or tuberculosis, and Dad had a specialization in chest diseases, so he was brought over just to help them with palliative care, essentially. And then in 1994, so about a year after we were there, South Africa became South Africa. Nelson Mandela got elected, and that ban got lifted, apartheid ended, and we were allowed to move a little bit. So we moved to a place called Queenstown, which is a small town, another 200 kilometers away. And that was probably a huge, significant event in my life, because I went from a school that didn't have a toilet, or a flushing toilet at least, to a school that was 160 years old, traditional rugby, like a traditional private school, if almost like in Australian terms. 16 rugby fields, cricket fields, Olympic size swimming pool, all that sort of stuff. So huge transition. I think I was only the second year of non-white kids allowed into that school. But my parents got to meet Nelson Mandela in 1993, before the election. He was doing his tour. I was too small, I wasn't invited on, but the doctors were the VIPs on the stage. He came and shook everyone's hands. So we had that little moment. So I look back on it probably more with fondness, and the significance of it probably resonates with me a lot more now. And it has throughout my whole adolescence. And as soon as I was able to comprehend what I just went through, it's kind of kept me grounded. It's just been the most fascinating life experience. I wouldn't change it for the world. It's essentially defined me in many ways. So on my first day, I couldn't speak anything other than Bengali. So I went to school, couldn't communicate at all. So it took me about a month to learn to speak Xhosa, because that was the local language over there. It's the language Nelson Mandela spoke. His village was only about 25 minutes away from ours, so he was pretty close. About a month, Xhosa for a month, English a month later. The teachers at that school, I just remember them being so dedicated and so focused on making sure I got the education that I wanted and I needed, or that they felt I needed. And probably grew my affinity for education. And I'm quite fortunate now that I do a lot of work in the education sector, and I get to help out the education sector a lot more. And I quite often refer back to that moment where my own education was so influenced by the quality of education I received in a remote African village. My life is so influenced by the quality of education my dad received in a remote Bangladeshi village. So that whole notion of challenges of kids in rural and remote areas getting quality education, or kids in disadvantaged communities getting quality education, and that being a pathway out for them, is, I think, it wasn't lost on me. So I kind of understood that. And the quality was really, really good, which was a shame to discover that once I moved to the bigger school, it wasn't thought of as good. And by the time I got to grade 7, I was ducks. Okay, so it just vindicated, not for myself, but it vindicated for that previous school, that the education they gave me was a solid foundation. And I think that sort of thing stays with you forever, I think, and you remember those things. And then I was really, really fortunate to have had great teachers even in my new school. And most recently, the world is so small. My English teacher in high school, her brother is a professor or a lecturer. I'll get this wrong. Her brother is an academic at QUT, of all places. Okay. And anyway, she came recently to visit him, and she texted me out of the blue, going on Facebook, saying, "Hey, I'm going to be in Brisbane." And I had the absolute privilege of taking her out to lunch. And we had to be able to do that as an adult, and to go back to the person who taught you so much. She was my English teacher in grade 8, 9, 10, and 11. And English is one of those subjects in school that really teaches you to think. Like, it's the one that teaches you to express thought and ponder and comprehend and explore topics. And she did that in spades. And she was my debating and public speaking coach as well. And she took a real interest in supporting me in that. And I did really well in that public speaking space. And even today, I do a lot of speaking, and I just put it back to her, right? And anyway, so I took her to lunch. We went to the city here in Brisbane and had a long lunch. It was fantastic. And we were talking about the transition. And we all talk about the transition from our own perspective, but it was so lovely to hear from her. These were teachers who've been teaching at that stage for 20, 30, 40 years in a white-only school that finally had to open its gates for non-white kids to come in. And the fact that I wasn't aware of that at the age of 14 or 15, like I didn't witness any of that, shows you just how well they did to hide whatever they were feeling. And she was revealing stuff about what was said in the staff room and how they did struggle. There were people who were struggling with accepting black kids coming into the school or people like myself coming into the school. But the fact that they were able to close the door at the staff room, and then once they stepped out, they treated us all as the same. I'll have enormous respect for them for that, right? But when you look back, there's still things we could have done better. And when I look back, I was like, oh, there's probably things I should have noted a little bit better. I was really lucky in that while I may have had social disadvantage in terms of skin color, I'd never had disadvantage from a wealth perspective. My dad was a doctor, so I had lots of privilege in that space. So I could stay pretty close to school for a significant part of my school. So being late for school wasn't a possibility. Whereas there were kids who were living in townships far away, who had to walk, who had to wake up at 4 a.m. to get to school at 7:30. And if they were 5 minutes late, they got punished. And at the same level as me, who just had to literally hear the bell, wake up, walk across. Like that sort of thing. Now when I look back on it, I was like, I wish I could have spoken to my friends at the time a little bit more about it and reflected and at least just let them know that I understood. And I probably didn't. And now I look back on it and it's like, wow, that was pretty bad what we did. The good news is the country, that school in particular, has managed to maintain its standards while remaining inclusive. And it's just, I'm so proud of that school, like that school and the ones in that area. So we were on the edge of Transkei, okay? So we had these schools that were so important from South Africa's social fabric. There were 3 or 4, well, there's probably about 8 to 10 in that region. They were all traditional 150-year-old private schools with massive sports fields and things like that, and big buildings that look like from the movies and stuff like that. The fact that those schools opened their doors for kids from disadvantaged communities and then didn't reduce that quality and expose them to those quality facilities and things like that. I look back now at the school facilities, they look as good as they did, if not better, than when I was there. We had a racing track at our school, but when I was there, it was a gravel track, and we had to run on the gravel track. I saw the other day, I saw some photos. We've now put that, the red mat that the athletes have in the proper places. Yeah, it's now got that. So the fact that kids are getting exposure to that in that community, those schools have just become enormous. The South African rugby team that just won the World Cup, the captain, Siya Kolisi, he's from one of those schools. And he's a child who couldn't afford anything, drank sugar water to bed because they didn't have food, and he would wait till the next day because in school they would give him one slice of bread at break time. And he's now the captain of South Africa in their rugby team, and he tells his story. And so I'm really glad that I was part of that journey. And yeah, it would be nice to have been aware of some of that stuff while I was there. But now that I am, hopefully I can make a difference knowing that. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, actually. When I find, at least, that when it's not around you and you focus on it, you end up practicing it a lot more. So in Bangladesh, we probably didn't even make a big deal of it, and we probably took it for granted if you look back on it, right? Whereas the moment we moved to South Africa, we were like, whoa, okay, there's no one here. We're the only Muslims, kind of thing. We were quite lucky. We had a couple of families there who were also from Bangladesh, who were also doctors. And so there was essentially the 3 families that made friends. One was a Hindu family, one was a Muslim family, and the other one was us. So that was our social circle, I guess, from a professional setting. And obviously I went to school, so made friends in school. The faith at that age, well, Islam doesn't impose faith on children as well, right? So it was practice in the sense that we'd pray. Dad always prayed, so prayed with Dad. We learned about what halal food is. So halal and kosher food is pretty much the same thing in many ways. Well, Muslims can eat kosher food in most cases, whereas the kosher ones are a little bit stricter. They probably can't eat halal food as much as easily as we can eat kosher food. But similar concept. So learning about that, never thought of that in Bangladesh, never knew what that was. I still remember, I think, but South Africa was the first time I went to eat something and my parents were like, you can't eat that. I'm like, what does that even mean? Why can't I eat that, right? Yeah, well, They were non-denominational, but we had lots of Christian teachings through the school. So we all had to carry hymn books. We had 3 assemblies a week. We had a pastor from one of the many churches in the area come in of all denominations every Monday. I knew every hymn off by heart. I won the Bible Knowledge Prize every single year in high school. Like, haven't missed it once because the stories were the same as the ones in the Quran. So I probably studied it twice because I studied it in school, and then after school I'd do Islamic classes and I'd learn the same stories again. So I had a bit of an advantage, and so I'd naturally just easily get the Bible Knowledge Prize every year. So yeah, so there was a very big, strong Christian faith in that school. It was quite present. I probably knew 30 hymns off by heart. Okay, favorite probably being "How Great Thou Art" and "Give Me Oil in My Lamp." Probably between those two, and maybe "Morning Has Broken" as well. Okay, there's quite a few that I still remember pretty well, right? I wouldn't sing, okay, because I was obviously Muslim, so I'd just read along and listen and participate. I'd be respectful, I'd stand for the prayer. Our classes started with the Lord's Prayer every morning, all that sort of stuff. I just remember we had a pastor or a priest come in every Monday on the Monday morning assembly, and it would be a different church every time. So it was Christian, but definitely non-denominational. South Africa's probably done inclusion, obviously with apartheid ending. We've probably done inclusion better than anyone else. I think it's just a thing. It's called the Rainbow Nation for a reason. Even our flag is designed to be inclusive with 7 different colors on it. Obviously the race one is still there, but the faith one is pretty good. So I've mentioned earlier that I lived in Queenstown. The truth is, initially I didn't live in Queenstown. I lived on the edge of Transkei in South Africa, in a small town called Ezibeleni, just outside of Queenstown, because we couldn't move into Queenstown just yet. Only a few years later we moved into Queenstown for social reasons, like we couldn't move in and affordability and things like that. It was easier for Dad to transfer inside the Transkei system rather than to move to the new South African hospital. So it took a little while to do that move. So while I was on the edge, there still wasn't much on the faith front, but Queenstown had a mosque. Okay, so that was the first time outside of Bangladesh I saw a mosque. And there was a family there, and I'll forever be indebted to them for my faith being as strong as it ended up being. He was a doctor as well, and his wife, so Uncle Muhammad and Auntie Rabia, as we lovingly called them. They basically dedicated their lives and their wealth to helping other kids and other parents get to classes. So South African schools run from 7:30 to 1:30 in the afternoon, and Islamic classes started at 2 p.m. So there was that gap. You had half an hour to get home, get changed, and Uncle Muhammad would come pick you up on his way back to the office after lunch. So he'd have a lunch break for an hour, pick me up on the way, drop me off at the Islamic class, go to his work, and then his wife would pick me up in the afternoon and drop me back home. My dad was working, we couldn't do that sort of stuff. So I was really lucky that probably at the age of, I was 11 by then, which is very late to start learning about your faith in a semi-formal way, whereas most of the people in there were there from the age of 5. Okay, so I was 6 years late, and I was learning. Islam encourages us to memorize parts of the Quran, and the chapters of the Quran get shorter as you go towards the end. So what we do with kids is we just start at the back of the Quran with the shortest chapters, and we just start at the back and just start memorizing as many as we can, and get as far forward as we can, essentially. And so I was learning the stuff that 4-year-olds already knew. So I was way behind. Okay, but again, I had a really great teacher there, and again, teaching just makes such a difference, right? And had a great teacher there who didn't make fun of me for being late. I didn't feel like I felt like I was that old, mature age student who didn't know anything while all the other kids. It was never felt like that. I felt like I belonged. I definitely, while I didn't know some of the Arabic stuff, I knew I could participate in the English-based stuff. So the topics on what is faith, I could participate in those conversations really, really easily, how to do certain things. So Islam is quite ritualistic, it's quite structured. So we have prayer times that are set during the day, so we had to learn how to pray. Thankfully, I knew a fair bit about how to pray. We have things like you have to wash yourself, like wash your hands and feet before you pray, so you cleanse yourself spiritually and physically. So there were lots of lessons as a child to learn what the rules of that are, like what are the criteria for when you have to wash yourself versus when you can get away with just wiping it away, that kind of thing, right? So there's a lot of that sort of stuff that I could participate in very, very easily. So I felt like I belonged, right, very, very quickly. And then in terms of memorizing the chapters, that didn't take too long. Like pretty soon we all taper off around 15 or 20 chapters, and then after that they get too long and no one remembers anything else. So I got to that 15 or 20 mark relatively quickly, like 3-4 years I was there. And the one thing I'll just note as well is, and I should give my mum a lot of credit for this, my mum, before we left for South Africa, kind of must have known that we will probably not get much exposure to Islamic studies over there as kids. So she hired a private tutor to come in and teach me how to read the Quran or Arabic before we left. So at the age of 5, I had for about 3-4 months when we knew we were going to the time we actually went. I had someone come in every day to just teach me the basics. Now, I didn't learn it well because it was a pretty rushed class, but at least when I went to the proper classes later in South Africa, I wasn't starting from scratch. I kind of at least had an affiliation with it, and I kind of understood it a little bit. I don't recall, I'm sure my mum would have made me read at home as well once in a while, but I don't recall any of that. So yes, I had this lovely little exposure to the faith pretty quickly. So much so, and I laugh at this when I look back, fondly. I was told to drop everything and become a scholar. So leave the secular studies, as we call it, the worldly studies, and drop everything and just go. My teacher was like, look, you're pretty smart. You've been gifted. I think you owe it to you owe it to the faith to drop everything and do that. Because at the time, the memorizing of the Quran is such a valued skill in our world. Okay, the Quran is such an important, memorizing it and then living it and understanding it. There was a very common thing that a lot of kids did in South Africa, which was you drop out of school in grade 6 and you come back in grade 8, but you go away for 2 years to memorize the Quran full time. And I thought, that's where I'm headed, right? So I thought, yep, I'll go do that. I'll drop out in grade 6, come out in grade 8, and by the time you get to grade 12, you've adjusted. You've got both. I wasn't given that option. I was told, no, you're dropping out and staying out. And so from the age of 6, I want you to then do the full theological studies and get the PhD equivalent and do all of that and become a proper jurist almost. Like Islamic studies are very legal. It's like canon law kind of thing. It's like understanding what's permitted, what's not, and all those sorts of things. And there's a lot to study to work out what is the most appropriate thing to do in a particular situation. And we need scholars to guide us through the interpretations of that. So I was told to become one of those, and so not only did I not do that, I didn't also go away and memorize the Quran either, and I just stayed in school. Got to grade 7, and then it became really hard to manage high school and Islamic studies after school as well, because my extracurricular stuff started coming up. I played a lot of sport in school. I did a lot of debating and public speaking and drama, and I got really involved. I took every opportunity that was given to me, so it was very hard. So that was it. That was my little taste of about 2.5 years of Islamic studies, but that was enough to just hold. I made some really good friends who made it cool to be Muslim, like who made it like it wasn't odd being Muslim. It was odd if you were to drink. It was odd if you wanted to do drugs, whereas it was cool to be a practicing Muslim who prayed 4 or 5 times a day. We all need that one influential friend, and for me, that guy's name was Majid Ahmed. Majid, I still talk to him. He was the Mr. Goody Two Shoes, straight as an arrow, and we would like measure ourselves to how we go against Majid. He probably hated it. He probably hated being held to that standard at the age of 12 or 13, but boy, he was a good kid. And we just went, yep, he became our role model in our peer group. And that helped. You only lived in Queenstown to go to that school. There was no other reason to stay in Queenstown. Queenstown was, we didn't even have a cinema. Like, it was a small, tiny little town in rural South Africa. It had a good boarding school. So all the farm communities from the local areas sent their kids to the boarding school over there. Had a couple of hospitals. Dad worked in one of them, and we just stayed there. But that was,